December 7, 1941, a date that would, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would soon declare, live in infamy, began like any other peaceful Sunday morning in the Hawaiian Islands. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, casting golden light across the naval base at Pearl Harbor, where the United States Pacific Fleet lay anchored in what seemed like perfect tranquility. Battleships lined Battleship Row, their gray hulls reflecting in the calm waters, while sailors prepared for another routine day of weekend leisure. Most had no idea that 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had positioned themselves approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, preparing to launch the most devastating surprise attack in American military history. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood aboard the carrier Akagi, watching as the first wave of 183 aircraft prepared for takeoff. The operation, codenamed Operation Z, had been meticulously planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who understood better than most Japanese military leaders the industrial might of America. Yamamoto had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but he held grave doubts about a prolonged conflict with the United States. Nevertheless, the decision had been made at the highest levels of Japanese government. With diplomatic relations deteriorating over Japan's expansionist policies in China and Southeast Asia, and with American economic sanctions strangling Japan's access to vital oil supplies, the Imperial Japanese Navy Command believed a preemptive strike represented their best chance to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. According to historical documentation preserved in the National Archives and numerous scholarly accounts, the Japanese strike force had maintained absolute radio silence during their 11-day journey across the North Pacific. They traveled through rough seas and thick fog, deliberately choosing a northern route rarely used by commercial shipping. The carriers had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuriil Islands on November 26, 1941, carrying a total of 414 aircraft. Every detail had been rehearsed repeatedly. Pilots had studied scale models and maps of Pearl Harbor until they could navigate the attack in their sleep. At approximately 6 o'clock that morning, as dawn broke over the Pacific, Commander Fuchida climbed into his Nakajima B-5N Type 97 bomber. Around him, the flight decks of all 6 carriers erupted into controlled chaos as aircraft engines roared to life. Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. The first wave would consist of 49 bombers armed with armor-piercing bombs modified from 16-inch naval shells, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters. Their targets had been precisely designated. The battleships, aircraft carriers, though none would be found in harbor that day, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft at Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and other military installations across Oahu. As Fuchida's aircraft lifted off from the pitching deck of the Akagi at 6:15, he looked back at the task force that represented Japan's gamble on swift, decisive victory. Within minutes, the armada of aircraft formed into attack formation, heading south toward their unsuspecting target. The die had been cast. Behind them, a second wave of 170 aircraft prepared to launch approximately 1 hour later. Back at Pearl Harbor, the American forces remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. 96 vessels of the Pacific Fleet rested in the harbor, including 8 battleships that represented the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific: USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania. The latter sat in dry dock undergoing maintenance. Approximately 375 aircraft were positioned at various airfields around Oahu, many parked wingtip to wingtip to protect against potential sabotage, a precaution that would prove tragically misguided when the attack came from the air. Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had received various intelligence warnings in the weeks preceding December 7th about rising tensions with Japan. However, the information remained fragmentary and inconclusive. Many military leaders believed that if Japan struck, the targets would be in Southeast Asia, perhaps the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies, not the Hawaiian Islands, which lay thousands of miles from Japanese territory. This assumption represented one of the greatest intelligence failures in American military history. On the morning of December 7th, most sailors and soldiers on Oahu were enjoying weekend liberty. Some slept late in their bunks aboard ship. Others had gone ashore the previous evening and stayed in Honolulu. Breakfast was being prepared in ship galleys. A few early risers stood on decks, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. At the Opana Point radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, two privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were completing their shift when, at approximately 7:02 in the morning, they detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north at a distance of 137 miles. Private Lockard, the more experienced operator, found the signal remarkable. He had never seen such a large radar return. The two soldiers debated whether to report the contact. When they finally telephoned the information center at Fort Shafter, they reached Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, an officer with minimal experience who assumed the aircraft must be a formation of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. Tyler told the radar operators not to worry about it. This fateful dismissal meant that Pearl Harbor received no advanced warning of the approaching Japanese strike force. Commander Fuchida, leading the first wave from his bomber, broke through the cloud layer at approximately 7:49 and looked down to see Pearl Harbor spread before him like a detailed map. The sight exceeded his most optimistic hopes. The American battleship sat stationary, with no torpedo nets deployed for protection. No fighter aircraft rose to intercept his formation. Anti-aircraft fire remained silent. The element of surprise had been achieved completely. At 7:49 and 30 seconds, Fuchida transmitted the code words that would echo through history. Tora, 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 meaning tiger, tiger, tiger. This signal informed Admiral Nagumo aboard the Akagi that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Moments later, Fuchida gave the order to attack. The Japanese aircraft peeled away from their formations and dove toward their designated targets. Within seconds, the peaceful Sunday morning exploded into chaos, fire, and death. The sleeping giant was about to be rudely awakened, and the world would never be the same. The first bombs fell at 7:55 on that fateful Sunday morning, transforming Pearl Harbor from a scene of peaceful military routine into an inferno of destruction within minutes. The initial targets were the aircraft at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, where Japanese Zero fighters strafed rows of American planes parked closely together. Lieutenant Colonel James Mollison, watching from Hickam Field, witnessed American aircraft exploding into flames before any could take off. The careful arrangement meant to prevent sabotage now facilitated wholesale destruction from the air. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers screamed in low over the harbor waters, releasing their specially modified Type 91 torpedoes. These weapons had been ingeniously adapted for Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depth, featuring wooden stabilizing fins that allowed them to run at depths of approximately 12 feet. The torpedoes struck with devastating effect. USS Oklahoma took 4 torpedo hits in rapid succession, causing the battleship to capsize within minutes. Sailors trapped below decks pounded desperately on the hull as the ship rolled over, their fates sealed in darkness and rising water. USS West Virginia absorbed 6 or 7 torpedoes on her port side. Only the quick thinking of Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, who ordered counter-flooding of starboard compartments, prevented her from capsizing like Oklahoma. She settled upright on the harbor bottom instead. Aboard the West Virginia, Captain Mervyn Bennion sustained mortal wounds from shrapnel when a bomb exploded on the nearby USS Tennessee. He refused to leave his post even as life drained from him, continuing to give orders until he died. Mess Attendant Doris Miller, an African-American sailor who had never been trained for combat duties due to the Navy's segregation policies, carried his captain to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, shooting at Japanese planes until his ammunition ran out, an act of heroism that would later earn him the Navy Cross. The most catastrophic moment came at 8:06 when a modified 16-inch armor-piercing bomb, dropped from a high-altitude bomber, penetrated USS Arizona's forward deck and detonated in or near the ship's forward ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion was so massive it lifted the 33,000-ton battleship out of the water. A fireball erupted skyward, visible for miles. The blast killed Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin van Valkenburg instantly on the bridge. Within 9 minutes, Arizona had settled on the harbor bottom, her superstructure ablaze. 1,177 sailors and Marines perished aboard her, nearly half of all American deaths that day. Quartermaster Robert Setterstrom aboard the nearby USS Vestal later described seeing men blown off Arizona's deck by the explosion, their bodies hurled through the air like rag dolls. Burning oil spread across the water's surface, creating pools of flame that trapped swimmers trying to escape sinking ships. Sailors jumped into water that was literally on fire, facing the terrible choice between burning aboard ship or in the water. The attack's fury continued without pause. USS California took 2 torpedoes and began settling slowly. USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, attempted to escape to the open sea. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the senior officer aboard, made the bold decision to sortie despite not having the ship's captain or executive officer present. As Nevada steamed down the channel past burning ships, Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attention on her, hoping to sink her in the channel and block the harbor entrance entirely. As USS Nevada struggled toward the harbor entrance, now the focus of concentrated Japanese dive bombing attacks, officers at the harbor control tower recognized the danger. If Nevada sank in the narrow channel, she would trap the entire Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor for weeks or months. Signalmen frantically waved flags and transmitted messages ordering Nevada to beach herself rather than risk blocking the channel. Lieutenant Commander Thomas reluctantly complied, deliberately grounding his burning battleship at Hospital Point. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 170 planes under Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived at approximately 8:54. These attackers found conditions dramatically different from what the first wave had encountered. Smoke from burning ships now obscured many targets. American anti-aircraft fire had intensified significantly as shocked gunners recovered from the initial surprise and manned their weapons. American resistance, though initially overwhelmed, was growing fiercer by the minute. At Ford Island Naval Air Station, Chief Aviation Ordnance Man John Finn set up a machine gun in an exposed position and continued firing at Japanese aircraft despite being wounded multiple times. His sustained fire throughout the entire 2-hour attack earned him the Medal of Honor. At Kaneohe Naval Air Station on the windward side of Oahu, sailors fought back with whatever weapons they could find. Aviation machinist's mate Guy Avery, though wounded, continued rearming aircraft until a direct bomb hit killed him. The destroyer USS Shaw, in floating dry dock, took 3 direct bomb hits that detonated her forward ammunition magazines. The explosion, photographed in one of the attack's most iconic images, sent her bow soaring through the air. Miraculously, Shaw would be repaired and returned to service. USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock alongside Shaw, escaped relatively light damage. The destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs, in the same dry dock, were hit by bombs and consumed by fire, their hulls eventually toppling over. Both would later be rebuilt using salvaged machinery. Historical records from the Naval History and Heritage Command document that several American pilots managed to get airborne during the attack. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, 2 Army Air Corps pilots stationed at Wheeler Field, drove to Halewa Field where their P-40 Warhawk fighters had been dispersed for training. They took off without orders and shot down several Japanese aircraft between them. Their aggressive response earned both pilots the Distinguished Service Cross. A handful of other American pilots also got airborne and engaged the enemy, though they remained vastly outnumbered. Navy Ensign Manuel Gonzalez managed to get his Curtiss P-36 Hawk fighter airborne from Wheeler Field, despite the strafing attacks. He shot down 1 Japanese bomber before his aircraft was damaged and he was forced to land. Captain Gordon Sterling took off from Bellows Field in an unarmed P-40 on a reconnaissance flight, spotted Japanese aircraft, and attempted to ram one before being shot down and killed. These individual acts of courage, though unable to significantly affect the attack's outcome, demonstrated that American fighting spirit had not been extinguished. Aboard the various ships, sailors performed extraordinary acts of heroism. On USS Maryland, which suffered relatively light damage being moored inboard of the capsized Oklahoma, sailors threw lines to men struggling in the oil-covered water and pulled them to safety. Rescue parties immediately began cutting through Oklahoma's hull to reach trapped survivors. For days afterward, rescuers would extract sailors from compartments inside the capsized hull, even as time worked against those still trapped in air pockets within the sunken vessel. By 9:45, the last Japanese aircraft departed, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation. The attack had lasted approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes, but it had accomplished in that brief time what Admiral Yamamoto had hoped for: the temporary crippling of America's Pacific Fleet. As the smoke began to clear, the full scope of the disaster became apparent to shocked survivors and officers attempting to organize rescue operations. The butcher's bill was staggering. 21 ships of the Pacific Fleet had been sunk or damaged. All 8 battleships present had been hit. Arizona lay on the bottom, still burning, entombing most of her crew. Oklahoma had capsized with over 400 men trapped inside. West Virginia and California had settled to the bottom in shallow water. Nevada sat beached and burning. Tennessee and Maryland had been damaged but remained afloat. Pennsylvania, in dry dock, had sustained relatively light damage. 3 destroyers had been devastated, 3 light cruisers damaged, 1 mine layer sunk, 4 other vessels damaged. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, most caught on the ground, with 159 damaged. The human cost dwarfed even the material losses. 2,403 Americans had been killed, including 68 civilians. 1,178 had been wounded. The majority of casualties came from the battleships, particularly Arizona. Many of the dead were young enlisted men, barely out of high school, who had joined the Navy seeking adventure and opportunity. They found death instead, in the space of minutes, with no warning and no chance to fight back effectively. According to documentation compiled by military historians and preserved in official Navy records, the Japanese had achieved a remarkable tactical victory at relatively low cost. They lost 29 aircraft shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and the few American fighters that got airborne. 5 midget submarines that attempted to penetrate the harbor were lost. 64 Japanese servicemen died in the attack. From a purely military standpoint, the exchange ratio was tremendously favorable to Japan. Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi considered launching a 3rd wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, maintenance facilities, and dry docks, but ultimately decided against it. His aircraft carriers had accomplished their primary mission, and remaining in the area risked American counterattack if carriers returned from their deployments. Commander Fuchida, circling over Pearl Harbor to assess damage before returning to the carriers, looked down at the destruction his forces had wrought with mixed feelings. The attack had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations, yet Fuchida, like Admiral Yamamoto, understood the potentially catastrophic strategic implications of what Japan had done. The American aircraft carriers had not been in port. USS Enterprise had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island, USS Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway, and USS Saratoga was undergoing maintenance in San Diego. These carriers, destined to become the primary instruments of Japanese defeat, had escaped unscathed. As Fuchida's aircraft flew north toward the waiting carriers, the men and women at Pearl Harbor began the grim work of fighting fires, rescuing survivors, and recovering the dead. Medical facilities across Oahu overflowed with wounded. Civilian doctors and nurses rushed to assist military medical personnel. Blood banks were overwhelmed by donors. The entire island of Oahu went on war footing, with civilians fearing an imminent Japanese invasion. In Washington, confusion reigned during the early hours as fragmentary reports arrived. The Japanese embassy had been ordered to deliver a diplomatic message breaking off negotiations to the State Department at precisely 1 o'clock Washington time, shortly before the attack began. But embassy staff had fumbled the translation and typing, delivering it late. This timing failure meant that the attack came without any formal declaration of war, adding treachery to American perceptions of Japanese aggression. News of the attack spread across the continental United States throughout that Sunday afternoon and evening, transmitted by radio broadcasts that interrupted regular programming. Families gathered around their radio sets in living rooms across America, listening in stunned disbelief as announcers reported the shocking developments from Hawaii. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, coming entirely without warning to the general American public, provoked immediate and intense public outrage. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack at approximately 1:40 Washington time, while eating lunch at his desk in the White House. His first reaction, according to those present, was a numbed disbelief that quickly transformed into cold fury. The president immediately summoned his cabinet and military advisors. Throughout the afternoon and evening of December 7th, Roosevelt met with administration officials, dictating drafts of what would become one of history's most memorable speeches. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, present at the cabinet meeting that evening, later recalled the president's controlled anger and absolute determination that this treachery would be answered decisively. Throughout the night of December 7th to 8th, Roosevelt worked on his address to Congress, refining the language with his speechwriters. The president himself added the famous phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," replacing the original draft's more prosaic, "a date which will live in world history." He understood the power of words to crystallize public sentiment and unite a previously divided nation. In the months before Pearl Harbor, America had been deeply split between interventionists who wanted to aid Britain and China against Axis aggression, and isolationists who insisted America should avoid entanglement in foreign wars. The Japanese attack obliterated that division overnight. On Monday, December 8, 1941, at 12:30 in the afternoon, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war. His 6-minute address became instantly iconic. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, Roosevelt began. He cataloged the attacks not only on Pearl Harbor, but also on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island, which had occurred simultaneously as part of Japan's coordinated Pacific offensive. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory, Roosevelt declared. The congressional response was overwhelming. 33 minutes after Roosevelt finished speaking, Congress voted to declare war on Japan. The Senate vote was unanimous. In the House of Representatives, only one member dissented, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I. Her vote ended her political career, but she remained committed to her principles. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States, and Congress reciprocated with its own declarations of war against those nations. The transformation of American society began immediately. Young men lined up at recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed the military's processing capacity. Industrial production pivoted toward war materiel. Factories that had produced automobiles retooled to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and military vehicles. Shipyards expanded to unprecedented size. Women entered the industrial workforce in massive numbers, filling positions vacated by men entering military service. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had earlier termed America's role in supplying Britain, now became an arsenal for America's own war effort as well. Back at Pearl Harbor, the massive salvage and repair operation began immediately. Navy Captain Homer Wallen took charge of the salvage effort, facing seemingly impossible tasks. Of the battleships damaged in the attack, all but Arizona and Oklahoma would eventually return to service, a remarkable achievement of American engineering and determination. California, West Virginia, and Nevada would be razed, repaired, modernized, and sent back to the Pacific to exact revenge on their attackers. While Americans mourned their dead and mobilized for war, Japanese leaders celebrated what appeared to be a stunning victory. Admiral Yamamoto, however, refused to join the jubilation. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve, Yamamoto reportedly said, though historians debate whether he actually spoke these exact words. Whether apocryphal or genuine, the sentiment accurately reflected Yamamoto's concerns. He had studied at Harvard University, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively in America. Unlike many of his colleagues in the Japanese military leadership, Yamamoto understood America's industrial capacity and the determination of the American people once aroused to action. The strategic consequences of the Pearl Harbor attack unfolded over the following months and years, revealing the attack's ultimate futility, despite its tactical brilliance. The Japanese had succeeded in temporarily neutralizing America's battleship fleet, but they had missed the most important targets: the aircraft carriers. In the carrier war that would dominate the Pacific conflict, the absence of American battleships at Pearl Harbor ultimately mattered little. Moreover, the Japanese had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, containing approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil, or the repair facilities and dry docks. These installations would prove crucial to American operations in the coming years. Historical analysis, including work by prominent military historians and documented in various scholarly sources, demonstrates that the Pearl Harbor attack represented a catastrophic strategic miscalculation by Japanese leadership. The attack unified American public opinion overnight, eliminating the isolationist movement that had constrained Roosevelt's ability to support the Allied cause. Before Pearl Harbor, polls showed approximately 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. After Pearl Harbor, that position reversed completely. Japan had gambled on delivering such a devastating blow that America would seek a negotiated peace rather than fight a prolonged Pacific War. Instead, the attack ensured that America would accept nothing less than Japan's unconditional surrender. The broader strategic situation also worked against Japan. Simultaneous with the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces struck throughout the Pacific and Asia. They attacked the Philippines, destroying much of the American Far East Air Force on the ground at Clark Field. They invaded Malaya and Thailand, beginning the campaign that would culminate in the fall of Singapore. They assaulted Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. This coordinated offensive secured Japan's southern resource area, particularly the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, which had been the ultimate strategic objective driving Japanese expansion. However, these conquests proved hollow. Japan now controlled vast territories but lacked the industrial base to defend them against America's inevitable counteroffensive. The United States possessed approximately 10 times Japan's industrial capacity. American steel production in 1941 exceeded 60 million tons annually compared to Japan's approximately 7 million tons. America could sustain losses and replace them. Japan could not. Admiral Yamamoto had warned that Japan needed to win the war quickly or not fight at all. Pearl Harbor ensured that America would fight, would not give up, and would bring its full industrial might to bear. The attack also cemented the alliance between the United States and other nations fighting Axis aggression. Britain, already at war with Germany and Italy since September 1939, gained a powerful ally with unlimited industrial resources. China, fighting Japan since the Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 1937, now had American support. The Soviet Union, invaded by Germany in June 1941 and fighting for survival, could count on American supplies through the Lend-Lease program. The Grand Alliance that would ultimately defeat the Axis powers had been formed, and Pearl Harbor had been the catalyst. In the United States, the attack's psychological impact proved as significant as its military consequences. Pearl Harbor provided a unifying national purpose that transcended the normal divisions of American politics and society. Americans from all backgrounds, regions, and classes rallied to the cause. The attack became a symbol of treachery that justified any sacrifice necessary for victory. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that resonated throughout the war years. The Pearl Harbor attack forced fundamental changes in American military thinking and organization. The intelligence failure that had allowed the Japanese to achieve complete surprise prompted major reforms in how America collected, analyzed, and disseminated intelligence. The separation between Army and Navy intelligence with inadequate sharing of information had contributed to the disaster. This recognition would eventually lead to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, consolidating intelligence functions under unified leadership. Military preparedness became an enduring American priority. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States maintained a relatively small peacetime military despite the wars raging in Europe and Asia. The Army numbered approximately 174,000 men in September 1939. After Pearl Harbor, American military forces expanded to eventually exceed 12 million personnel. This expansion transformed American society, taking men from farms, factories, offices, and schools, and forging them into a military force that would fight on multiple continents simultaneously. The attack also accelerated technological development. Radar, which had detected the incoming Japanese strike force but been ignored, became a priority technology. The United States invested heavily in radar development, eventually producing sophisticated systems that provided crucial advantages in both air and naval warfare. Radio communications, code breaking, aircraft design, naval architecture, all received intensive focus and funding. The Manhattan Project, initiated before Pearl Harbor but dramatically expanded afterward, would produce the atomic weapons that ultimately forced Japan's surrender. For the survivors of Pearl Harbor, the attack left permanent scars. Sailors who escaped the burning Arizona, Oklahoma, or West Virginia carried memories of lost shipmates for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term did not exist in 1941. The annual Pearl Harbor Survivors Association reunions, held every December 7th, provided opportunities for veterans to remember and honor their fallen comrades. As the decades passed and survivors aged, these gatherings took on increasing poignancy. Lauren Bruner, who escaped from Arizona's burning superstructure by climbing a line to the nearby repair ship Vestal, later described swimming through oil-covered water while Japanese planes strafed swimmers. He bore physical and psychological scars for life. Donald Stratton, also aboard Arizona, spent months in hospitals recovering from severe burns before returning to service. Sterling Cale survived the capsizing of Oklahoma and later participated in the salvage operations that recovered his ship. Each survivor carried unique memories of courage, fear, loss, and survival from that terrible morning. The families of those who died faced different but equally profound challenges. Many never recovered remains of their loved ones for burial. The 1,177 men who died aboard Arizona, for example, remained entombed in the ship, which was left where she sank as a permanent memorial. Gold Star flags appeared in windows across America, indicating families who had lost sons, fathers, or husbands in service. The emotional toll of these losses rippled through communities, particularly in small towns where multiple young men from the same high school or neighborhood had enlisted together and died together. The Pearl Harbor attack also became embedded in American popular culture. Movies, books, songs, and eventually television shows and video games depicted the attack, shaping how subsequent generations understood the event. Some portrayals were historically accurate, others took dramatic liberties. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, became one of America's most visited war memorials, ensuring that millions of Americans each year would learn about December 7, 1941, and reflect on its meaning. Diplomatic repercussions extended far beyond the immediate military conflict. The attack demonstrated the dangers of allowing international tensions to escalate without effective diplomatic resolution. The breakdown of negotiations between Japan and the United States in the months before Pearl Harbor showed how failure to find peaceful solutions to legitimate grievances could lead to catastrophic war. These lessons influenced post-war efforts to create international institutions, particularly the United Nations, designed to provide forums for resolving conflicts without resorting to armed violence. The passage of more than 8 decades since that December morning has not diminished Pearl Harbor's significance in American national memory. The attack remains the single most traumatic event in American military history until the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, another surprise assault that galvanized national unity and prompted major military action. The parallels between December 7, 1941, and September 11, 2001, are frequently noted by historians and political leaders. both representing moments when America's sense of security was shattered by sudden, unexpected attack. For Japan, the Pearl Harbor attack carries different but equally complex meanings. The immediate post-war period saw many Japanese viewing themselves primarily as victims of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with less emphasis on Japanese aggression that had prompted the American response. Over time, particularly as Japan developed into a prosperous democracy and close American ally, more nuanced understandings emerged. Contemporary Japanese historians generally acknowledge that the Pearl Harbor attack represented an act of aggression and a strategic blunder that led to Japan's catastrophic defeat. The military lessons of Pearl Harbor continue to influence strategic thinking. The danger of surprise attack, the importance of intelligence, the need for vigilance even in peacetime, the value of redundancy in defense systems. All these principles derive partly from analysis of what went wrong on December 7, 1941. Modern American military doctrine emphasizes preparedness, distributed forces rather than concentrated targets, and constant awareness of potential threats. The phrase "another Pearl Harbor" has entered political discourse as shorthand for any potential surprise attack that could catch America unprepared. The actual site of the attack has become sacred ground. The USS Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken battleship's remains, receives approximately 2 million visitors annually. The memorial's stark white structure, designed by architect Alfred Price himself, a victim of wartime hysteria as an Austrian-American who was initially detained after Pearl Harbor, spans the ship without touching it. Through openings in the memorial's floor, visitors can look down at the rusting hulk below, where oil still seeps from Arizona's fuel tanks, black tears as they are called, rising to the surface in a persistent reminder of the men entombed below. The USS Missouri, the battleship on whose deck Japan formally surrendered to end World War II on September 2, 1945, is now permanently moored at Pearl Harbor, near the Arizona Memorial. This deliberate positioning creates powerful symbolism. The place where the war began for America positioned adjacent to the place where the war ended. Visitors can stand on Missouri's deck, looking across the harbor at Arizona, and contemplate the journey from one to the other, the suffering, sacrifice, and ultimate victory that connected those two moments. Every December 7th, Pearl Harbor holds remembrance ceremonies attended by the dwindling number of survivors, their families, military personnel, and civilians who come to honor the fallen. As the 90th anniversary of the attack approached in 2031, organizers recognized that very few, if any, survivors would remain alive. The last survivor to die, Ken Potts, passed away in April 2023 at age 102. Lauren Bruner had died in September 2019 at age 98. With the passing of the generation that experienced Pearl Harbor firsthand, the challenge of keeping memory alive falls to subsequent generations. Educational programs ensure that young Americans learn about Pearl Harbor. The National Park Service, which administers the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument at Pearl Harbor, provides extensive educational resources. Schools across America teach about the attack as a pivotal moment in American and world history. Yet as living memory fades, the event risks becoming abstract history rather than lived experience, creating an ongoing challenge for educators and memorial organizations. The ultimate legacy of Pearl Harbor may be found not in the military defeat inflicted that morning, but in the response it provoked. America emerged from World War II as a superpower, transformed from an isolated continental nation into a global leader with military bases worldwide and commitments to collective security. The post-war international order, NATO, the United Nations, the International Human Rights Framework, the global economic system, all reflect American power and values shaped partly by the Pearl Harbor experience. The attack that was meant to intimidate America instead awakened it to its responsibilities and potential as a world power. For the men who died at Pearl Harbor, their sacrifice was not in vain. They were casualties of the first day of America's involvement in a war that ended with the defeat of fascism and militarism, the liberation of millions from oppression, and the creation of an international order that, despite its flaws, has prevented another global conflict on the scale of World War II. Every person who has lived in freedom since 1945 owes a debt to those who died on December 7, 1941, and to all who served in the war that followed. As the sun sets over Pearl Harbor today, it illuminates a scene vastly different from that fateful morning. The water is still tranquil, but it now floats naval vessels of a modern, professional American military that learned the lessons Pearl Harbor taught. The flags of the United States and Japan fly side by side, representing former enemies transformed into staunch allies. The memorial structures stand as silent witnesses to both tragedy and resilience. And beneath the water, within the hull of USS Arizona, the remains of 1,177 American servicemen rest in eternal vigilance, their sacrifice remembered, their story told, their legacy honored. December 7, 1941 remains, as President Roosevelt declared it would be, a date that lives in infamy, but also in memory, in tribute, and in the continuing commitment to defend the freedoms for which they died.